Since it was first announced all the way back in 2020, I have been a huge supporter of Final Fantasy XVI. This game had a tremendous amount of hype behind it, being worked on by Square Enix's Creative Business Unit 3, headed by Naoki Yoshida, who is the producer and director of Final Fantasy XIV. Expectations for this game were through the roof, and today we are finally discussing if Final Fantasy XVI lives up to the hype. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button because this is my long-awaited review of Final Fantasy XVI. I want to preface this review by saying there are times where I am quite critical of this game, but make no mistake, I still really loved it. However, I really can't ignore the areas that it's lacking, and I wish to see Creative Business Unit 3 do even better on their next outing. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that I've never deeply loved a game this much that I also had so much to critique about it as well. But let's get into it. First and foremost, this is the best looking Final Fantasy game ever. I was truly blown away by the visuals in this game. The fact that some of this game looks like the pre-rendered movies of the old days but is being done in-engine in real time is honestly absolutely mind-blowing. From minor NPCs to major NPCs, everyone and everything in this game looks incredible. There are many incredibly impressive scenes in this game, particularly the icon fight scenes. That being said, there are also many stilted scenes in the game as well too. Now these are used in a number of games, including other Square Enix games such as Final Fantasy VII Remake. These are the scenes where two characters just kinda sit there stiff with minimal camera work talking to each other. It seemed to me like Final Fantasy XVI had a bigger proportion of these than other games. That being said, it's something that far from ruined the experience, and overall this is an incredibly stunning looking game, with some gorgeous music by Masayoshi Soken to match. Admittedly, I do prefer the style of Final Fantasy XIV's music, but regardless, the music here is still pretty good, and it's still what I would ultimately consider a top tier Final Fantasy soundtrack. Speaking of sound, it is no exaggeration to say that this is the best sounding JRPG in English maybe ever. There is just nothing inside or outside of this franchise that even comes remotely close. This is in part to two things. The first is that the game's English script and English voice acting were mastered first, with the Japanese voice acting and script being redone to better match the English. The second is that you just had phenomenal voice actors like Ben Starr, who give absolutely breathtaking performances in this game. The way that Final Fantasy XVI was recorded needs to be the standard for how Final Fantasy games are recorded in English going forward. No, seriously, the bar here is set that high, and every line of dialogue sounds like it could be ASMR. Then we got the combat in this game, and boy, the combat is expressive, fluid, and a little too easy. So let's back a little. This game is often compared to Devil May Cry. However, I think unlike Devil May Cry, this game is a lot more accessible due to its more simplified inputs. Doing combos in Devil May Cry can oftentimes look like that of fighting games. Final Fantasy XVI streamlines things by having your specials mapped to cooldowns, these being your iconic abilities. I think this is great as it allows more people who aren't uber experienced with action games to be able to get a lot more out of Final Fantasy XVI's combat than they would out of Devil May Cry without practicing quite a bit. However, there were times wherein I felt that things were a bit limiting. Having a delayed combo or heavy attacks or anything alike would have made combat a little bit more interesting, and would have gave me more to do than mashing square when all of my cooldowns were on cooldown. I think this combat system feels really good, and there is a surprising amount of depth to it if you really go looking for it. That being said, a lot of the satisfaction in an action game system comes from overcoming challenge. It's just unfortunate that there isn't much challenge to overcome in this game. The icon versus icon fights are so epic, and yes, they do feel fantastic. However, I just couldn't help but think during most of them, this would be so much better if the boss was as challenging as the spectacle led me to believe that it was. It got to a point whenever I got something like expanded inventory or anything that strengthened my character, I somewhat lamented it because it would make the game easier. For example, like any other Final Fantasy games, you can buy potions in this game, but actually, why would you do that? Whenever you die in this game, you get restocked full of potions. This also includes if you die mid-boss. And so what I actually realized throughout the game is, why would I ever spend money buying potions? If I really wanted to restock my potions, I could just intentionally die. And since the game has multiple checkpoints throughout every boss, restores your health to full when you die, restores your potions to full when you die, it's almost literally impossible to just be stuck on any given boss. I think maybe they didn't factor in what the Soulsborne games have done to the population, but I want epic struggles to feel like exactly that. An epic struggle. But if I'm being more honest with myself, I think they tried too hard to accommodate to their turn-based audience, instead of just making an action game for action game audiences as they should have. That being said, a game doesn't have to be brutally challenging in order for me to enjoy it. I enjoyed Kingdom Hearts 2 before Critical Mode and Final Mix were ever a thing, and I still really enjoy Final Fantasy XVI's brilliant combat system. It just would be better if you could realize the game's full brilliance on the first playthrough. Then you have the icon versus icon fight, and these are some of the most keynote moments that Final Fantasy has ever had. The absolute best spectacle in an FF game, period. It's not even a discussion. There's no game that even comes remotely close, and those that do, it is strictly limited to cutscenes. Icons versus icon fights makes that into gameplay, and it is some of the highest moments that the series has ever had. My only complaint here is that I wish there were more moments where you were moving Ifrit freely and fighting and comboing as him, because I really love the way Ifrit controls. Then you have Valistia, which is beautiful. Environments look absolutely gorgeous, and if I said it before, I will say it again, this is the best Final Fantasy has ever looked. Do you guys remember back during Final Fantasy XIII's development when they said that HD towns were too hard? In this game, you'll sometimes find 3 or 4 little settlements or towns within a single zone. In fact, out of all the HD games thus far, this one has the most towns, barring something like Final Fantasy XIV. Valistia's world is so gorgeous that it's a little disappointing that there is nothing to actually explore or no real secrets to uncover. Most branching paths exist only for either a hunt or a side quest, and only once they've become activated, making the world feel just unfortunately lacking at times. You can only find items and potions in the environment, with crafting only giving you a small stat increase and not being that necessary. And when the game actively incentivizes the player to die so that they can restock their potions and not spend gil, why would you go looking for potions? To be honest, I almost never even once checked how much gil I had in this game. I couldn't even tell you how much gil I finished with. There's nothing actually valuable to spend the money on, and whenever you do need to spend it, you probably have more than enough. It kind of reminds me of the Zelda games pre-Breath of the Wild, where you could always find a ton of rupees throughout the world, but nothing really important or valuable to really spend them on. That's a lot how this game is. But here's a hot take. The side quest in this game, I actually think that multiple of the side quests in this game strike upon the best side quest in the Final Fantasy series. Yeah, that's not saying much considering the side content in Final Fantasy games isn't exactly the greatest. The structure of these side quests are very much MMO-like, which isn't too surprising given that this is the Final Fantasy XIV team. However, the rewards for them do usually suck, as again, there's nothing they can really give you in this game that is actually useful. However, what was special about this game is that I was doing the side quests for the stories in them, and how they expanded the characters, the lore, and the world of Valistia. Many of these are full-on side stories in a way that the Final Fantasy franchise has never seen, and while they aren't hard required to understand the overarching narrative, I feel like those that do these quests will walk away with totally different impressions of the game's story than those that didn't. You're gonna understand every character and everything that happens in this world a lot more thoroughly. It is for this reason I cannot recommend enough that you do the side quests in this game, at least on your first playthrough. You can totally ignore them on the second playthrough, but on that first one, you're going to want to do them. While the game does have some absolutely throwaway side quests in the beginning, like delivering food, the mid to late game side quests are some of the most satisfying emotional quests that Final Fantasy has had. The one about Torgal toward the end in particular brought me to tears on stream. But let's talk about the main story. The main story is the absolute reason to play Final Fantasy XVI. One of the main criticisms I've had of Final Fantasy storytelling for over the years now is them no longer committing to death. They commit to death here. In fact, I think they enjoy death maybe a little too much in this game. Sometimes it was a little upsetting when they killed off characters a bit too fast, which I thought some of those characters could have had a much bigger impact if they lived a little bit longer before you killed them. That being said, I'm not going to complain. This has been an ongoing issue with Final Fantasy since Final Fantasy X-2. Honestly, in many ways, not even Final Fantasy XIV commits to death anymore. And after Final Fantasy VII Remake potentially unwinding deaths that had already been committed to, you know, I'll take it. While I have seen so many express the grievances with how dark fantasy is filled with misery and they just don't like the dark direction that this story takes, I'm happy to report that they are wrong. I love misery and I love how miserable and dark this story is sometimes. I think it is incredibly well grounded, and I think it practically addresses how people would use magic in an ether-rich world, developing an extreme over-reliance on it. This game is somehow both grounded and fantastical at the same time. It's interesting that the game was being so heavily promoted with Game of Thrones being used as inspiration, and yet I have done so many Kamehameha waves and beam struggles in this game that I would actually think that this game was inspired by Dragon Ball Z. That's not a bad thing, I love Dragon Ball, but the game is a lot more anime than it lets on. Like, people thought this would be like full-on Western RPG, and it would forsake all of its Japanese roots. That is so not the case. Sure, it doesn't have the same anime flair and expression that you may find in the character designs of something like Final Fantasy VII or previous FF games, but the anime DNA is incredibly strong in this title. In fact, the last act of the game is like the ultimate manifestation of Final Fantasy. If it were possible for something to be too Final Fantasy, that is basically how it described the later chapters in this game. While Final Fantasy XVI does not feature a party in the same sense, you do have a character or two that will follow alongside you. However, in the place of a party, you have something that I find truly unique to this FF game. You have the community at the Hideaway. Now, the folks at the Hideaway are all wonderful people, and you get to know them better, particularly by doing all of their side quests. By the end of this game, I was really attached to my Hideaway family. It kind of gave me those old school feelings of like Digimon World or Dark Cloud, where I was kind of taking care of like this town, this group of people, and helping their needs and growing this community. It's a really satisfying feeling. The story and characters are the absolute reason to play this game, though it's unfortunate that the pacing between these moments, the big set pieces and the notable character development, is a bit shaky. I would always joke about wanting a single player Final Fantasy XIV, and this is kind of that, but not quite in the way that I was hoping, as the game design and general progression are literally that of Final Fantasy XIV's, even down to the fight that dungeons and boss fights are usually these separate instances, and completing a big boss fight in a dungeon usually winds down in the same way that it does in FF14. Clearly for me, as an FF14 player, it's not a deal breaker. However, I could also see this being a huge turnoff for non-FF14 players, and it can contribute to the game having a feeling of poor pacing. Indeed, the highs in this game are some of the highest I have ever experienced in video games, but the lows are pretty low. And much like I felt with Final Fantasy VII Remake, I felt like both of these games would have been a lot better if they were maybe 15 hours shorter, and just really focused on getting you from one big moment to the next. Ultimately though, I loved Final Fantasy XVI, and it's a game that I haven't stopped thinking about since I beat it. It has numerous flaws, flaws that I could go on about at length. But at the end of the day, what matters most is the impact that a game has on you. And the impact that Final Fantasy XVI has was pretty tremendous for me. And it makes me incredibly enthused to see what Creative Business Unit 3's next game will be. Because if they continue to refine and build what they have here, I genuinely believe they will create something utterly mind-blowing. And I look forward to whenever we inevitably get the DLC for this game. You guys know I don't do numerical review scores, so I give this game an ice cream scoop out of a cone.